Hello students, today we'll be discussing Michel Foucault. Before going into the details of Foucault's theory, we must first try to understand Foucault. So his theory primarily addressed the relationship between power and knowledge and how they are used as form of social control through societal institutions. Though often cited as post-structuralist and postmodernist, Foucault rejected these labels. His thought has influenced academics, especially those working in communication studies, anthropology, sociology, criminology, cultural studies, literary theory, feminism, and critical theory. So, here is a brief biographical sketch of Foucault to understand the concept of his theories, especially. As a student, he was brilliant but psychologically tormented. He became academically established during the 1960s, holding a series of positions at French universities before his election in 1969 to the ultra prestigious Collège de France, where he was a professor of the history of systems of thought until his death. From the 1970s on, Foucault was very active politically. He was a founder of the group des Informations sur les prisons and often protested on behalf of marginalized groups. He frequently lectured outside France, particularly in the United States. An early victim of AIDS, Foucault died in Paris on June 25, 1984. In addition to works published during his lifetime, his lecture at Collège de France, published posthumously, contain important elucidations and extensions of his ideas. One might question whether Foucault is in fact a philosopher. His academic formation was in psychology and its history, as well as in philosophy. His books were mostly histories of medical and social sciences. His passions were literary and political. Nonetheless, almost all of Foucault's work can be fruitfully read as philosophical in either or both of two ways, as carrying out philosophy's traditional critical project in a new manner, and as a critical engagement with the thought of traditional philosophers. So, talking about the intellectual background of Foucault, we can say that he began as a philosopher, and obviously there was a philosophical environment in which Foucault was educated. He entered the École Normande Supérieure, the standard launching pad for all major French philosopher in 1946. So during the heyday of existential phenomenology. So Merleau-Ponty, whose lecture he attended, and Heidegger were particularly important, who had a major influence on Foucault or his theories. Hegel and Marx were also of major interest. Hegel, through the interpretation of his work offered by John Hippolyte, and Marx through the structuralist reading of Louis Althusser, both teachers who had a strong impact on Foucault at the École Normale. It is obviously not surprising that Foucault's earliest works were written in the grip of respectively existentialism and Marxism, but he soon turned away from both Marxism and existentialism. In a quite different vein, Foucault was enthralled by French avant-garde literature, especially the writings of Georges Bataille and Maurice Blanchot, where he found this experimental concreteness of existential phenomenology without what he came to see as dubious philosophical assumptions about subjectivity. Of particular interest was his literature's evocation of limit experiences, which push us to extremes where conventional categories of intelligibility begin to break down. This philosophical milieu or environment provided materials for the critique of subjectivity and the corresponding archaeological and genealogical methods of writing history that inform Foucault's project of historical critique. Michel Foucault, the French postmodernist, has been hugely influential in shaping understanding of power, leading away from the analysis of actors who use power as an instrument of coercion, and even away from the discrete structure in which those actors operate towards the idea that power is everywhere, diffused and embodied in discourse, knowledge, and regime of truth. Power for Foucault is what makes us what we are, operating on a quite different level from other theories. So, his work marks a radical departure from previous modes of conceiving power and cannot be easily integrated with previous ideas, as power is diffused rather than concentrated, embodied and enacted rather than possessed, discursive rather than purely coercive, and constitutes agents rather than being deployed by them. So, Foucault challenges the idea that power is wielded by people or groups by way of episodic or sovereign acts of domination or compulsion, seeing it instead as dispersed and pervasive, which is omnipresent. Power is everywhere and comes from everywhere. So, in this sense, is neither an agency nor a structure. Instead, it is a kind of meta power, a regime of truth that pervades society and which is in constant flux and negotiation. Foucault uses the term power knowledge to signify that power is constituted through accepted forms of knowledge, scientific understanding, and truth. Further, Foucault says that truth is a thing of this world. It is produced only by virtue of multiple forms of constraint, and it induces regular effect of power. Each society has its regime of truth, its general politics of truth, that is, the type of discourse which it accepts and makes functions as true, the mechanisms and instances which enable one to distinguish the true and false statements, the means by which each is sanctioned, the technique and procedure accorded value in the acquisition of truth, the status of those who are charged with saying what counts as true. So, this general politics and regime of truth are the result of scientific discourse and institution, and are reinforced and redefined constantly through the education system, the media, and the flux of political and economic ideologies. So, in this sense, the battle of truth is not for some absolute truth that can be discovered and accepted, but it is a battle about the rules according to which the true and false are separated and specific effect of power are attached to the true. A battle about the status of truth and the economic and political role it plays. So, this is the inspiration for Hayward's focus on power as boundaries that enable and constrain possibilities for action, and on people's relative capacities to know and shape their boundaries or these boundaries. So, Foucault is one of the few writers on power who recognize that power is not just a negative force or repressive thing that forces us to do things against our wishes, but can also be a necessary, productive and positive force in society. He says we must cease once and for all to describe the effect of power in all negative terms. It excludes, it represses, it censors, it abstracts, it masks, it conceals. In fact, power produces. It produces reality. It produces domains of object and rituals of truth. The individual and the knowledge that may be gained of him belong to this production. So, according to Foucault, power is also a major source of social discipline and conformity in shifting attention away from the sovereign and episodic exercise of power, traditionally centered in feudal states to force their subjects. Foucault pointed to a new kind of disciplinary power that could be observed in the administrative systems and social services that were created in 18th century Europe, such as prisons, schools and mental hospitals. So, the systems of surveillance and assessment no longer required force or violence, as people learn to discipline themselves and behave in expected ways. And this is what we are going to study in Discipline and Punish in Panopticon, or the concept of panopticism, which was described or discussed by Foucault. Now, Foucault was fascinated by the mechanism of prison surveillance, school discipline, system for the administration and control of population, and the promotion of norms about bodily conduct, including sex. He studied psychology, medicine and criminology and their roles as bodies of knowledge that define norms of behavior and deviance. Physical bodies are subjugated and made to behave in certain ways as a microcosm of social control of the wider population through what he called biopower. Disciplinary and biopower create a discursive practice or a body of knowledge and behavior that defines what is normal, acceptable, deviant, etc. But it is a discursive practice that is nonetheless in constant flux. A key point about Foucault's approach to power is that it transcends politics and sees power as an everyday, socialized and embodied phenomena. This is why state-centric power struggles, including revolutions, do not always lead to change in the social order. For some, Foucault's concept of power is so elusive and removed from agency or structure that there seems to be little scope for practical action. But he has been hugely influential in pointing to the ways that norms can be embedded as to be beyond our perception, causing us to discipline ourselves without any willful force from others. Contrary to many interpretations, Foucault believed in possibilities for action and resistance. He was an active social and political commentator who saw a role for the organic intellectual. His ideas about action were, like Hayward's, concerned with our capacities to recognize and question socialized norms and constraints. To challenge power is not a matter of seeking some absolute truth, but of detaching the power of truth from the forms of hegemony, social, economic and cultural, within which it operates at the present time. So Foucault says discourse can be a site of both power and resistance, with scope to evade, subvert or contest strategies of power. The power cube is not easily compatible with Foucauldian understanding of power, but there is scope for critical analysis and strategic action at the level of challenging or shaping discourse. For example, taking the psychological or cultural meaning of invisible power and hegemony as a lens with which to look at the whole. So, Foucault's approach has been widely used to critique development thinking and paradigms and the ways in which development discourse are imbued with power. So, we are going to study this in detail in Panopticon, or the concept of panopticism by Foucault. This is all for today. Thank you all.